My name is Sarah Barger-Ranney. I am a class of 2002 graduate from Williams, and I live in Berkeley, California, where it finally feels like spring after really a historic season of rainfall here in California. I'm so honored to be your host. Please continue to put your name, your class year, your location if you've just joined us in the chat. And this is a Zoom meeting, so I think we're all good at this by now, but unless you want to be heard, please mute yourself. We will have a conversation or an opportunity for Q&A at the end of this session, and you are welcome to put any questions that come about in the chat throughout the session. But otherwise, stay muted so that we can hear our wonderful honored guests today. So I'd like to kick us off by recognizing, wow, this is a really amazing group of women. In addition to our moderator, Cynthia Van Eck, parent of a class of 21, and speakers Meg Lowman and Laurie Wayburn. I'm sorry, Meg Lowman is class of 76. We have 77 women who RSVP'd for this, and our list is growing as this hour progresses, ranging in class years from 72 to 2020, who are joining us here today. So today we're going to have the privilege of hearing from three leaders at the forefront of climate solutions in the forest conservation space. And while we likely already know it, today will be further evidence of how vital it is to have women in leadership positions. When it comes to women in leadership, Williams is doing a really good job. And I thought it would be good to reinforce that with a few statistics. Women comprise 60% of the senior staff at Williams, more than half of the board of trustees, more than half of the Williams volunteers across the college, the chair of the board of trustees in Liz Robinson, class of 90, and last but never least, our president, Maud Mandel. So even at a place like Williams, and even with amazing leadership statistics like that, there has been a lag in women's leadership giving compared to men. I know that the staff took a look at this, and between 2016 and 2018, they took a look at the demographics of Williams donors, and one critical fact came to light, that while women at Williams make up 40% of the alumni body, we only make up 26% of leadership donors to the alumni fund, and that's defined as gifts of $2,500 or more. Today, women comprise 31% of leadership donors, so that has increased, but we do still have some work to do before we get to 40%. I say all this because I am a member of the We Lead Advisory Board, who's really looking at ways that we can engage women further in leadership giving with the college. And as we celebrate 50 plus years of coeducation at Williams, the goal of initiatives like this one today is to engage Williams women, close the gap at each giving level, and ultimately reach parity with men. By building upon the strength that we already have as leaders, we believe we can dramatically increase women's leadership giving at all levels, thereby strengthening Williams and providing a brighter financial future for generations to come. So with that as context, I hope you'll consider joining me in making Williams a philanthropic priority. So, okay, now turning to the main event, our primary goal this afternoon, and with all our events, is to connect ETH women with different experiences and from different class years with one another through interesting conversations, and ultimately inspire you to engage more deeply with Williams on a philanthropic level. Today, we get to do that through conversation with Cynthia Van Eck, Meg Lowman, and Laurie Wayburn, three women who are working to harness the power of forests to combat climate change. What really excites me about today's program is that despite the very real and very scary reality of climate change, these women are focused on solutions, useful, innovative solutions. And that's an inquiry and practice that feels very rooted in the Williams tradition. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Cynthia.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. I am so happy to be here and be involved in this conversation today. While I did not go to Williams, my husband, brother-in-law, and one of our 4 children graduated from the school. So I have to say there is a little purple in my blood. How I got involved with forests is an interesting story. My husband had an eccentric bachelor uncle who was very interested in wood, forests, climate change way before his time. And in the 80s and 90s, he started accumulating forest property in the Northwest, in the South, even as far away as New Zealand. And when he passed, he left it in a trust to go to charity, but to be managed by the Pacific Forest Trust and Laurie Wayburn. So that's how Laurie and I have become friends. I have worked with her over the last few years. I have visited the properties. It is amazing to see the work that they are doing. And I've taken our children out with me. It has become somewhat of a passion in a short period of time, because I do see that people are and can make a difference. Laurie, why don't you tell them a little bit more about yourself and PFT?
Oh, well, thank you, Cynthia. And thank you so much to all of you at Williams. I too did not go to Williams, but I get to claim my affiliation from my best friend and from my niece and nephew, all of whom graduated from Williams. So this is a wonderful conversation to have. Pacific Forest Trust is an organization that I co-founded with another woman with the goal of really changing how and why we conserve forests, and really to take conservation out of the optional nice thing to do to the essential fundamental business of why we manage forests. So to take conservation as this grounding of the forest ecosystem. I think we all on this call know that forests are more than just wood. It's more than just trees. They're systems. And if we need anything from forests, we need water, we need clean air, we need a more stable climate, and we need this treasure trove of biodiversity that we all rely on. But in founding the Pacific Forest Trust, we realized that nobody paid for any of those things. We expected landowners to protect those things as a responsibility, but with no financial return. And most people are driven by what we call enlightened self-interest, and that includes a financial return. So what we wanted to do, and what I feel we have succeeded in some significant part in doing, is to make these services of forests, like climate stabilization, like the provision of water, like being habitat for myriad wildlife, to pay for those. And to make that competitive with landowners in terms of what does pay them traditionally, which is timber commodities and development. And over this past 30 years that the organization has been around, we've driven a new national model for private forest land conservation with working forest conservation easements. We've gotten the conservation and management of standing forests for whole forest systems into climate policy, and that's resulted in two things: public monies and also private monies. Many of you are familiar with carbon markets, and I think Meg and I would love to have a little discussion about that at some point in this. And we've gotten forest watersheds recognized for their role in water system infrastructure, the same way we recognize the role of dams and pipes and canals. Those dams, pipes, and canals don't work if the water doesn't come in to them. So our focus has really been to reward landowners for doing the right thing, which is managing forests for all the values that we rely on. And I have been extraordinarily fortunate in having some amazing women on my board. My current chair is a woman named Ann Barteska, who was number 2 at the USDA for a while. But Meg Lowman was a member of our board when she was out on the West Coast at Cal Academy of Sciences. And I had a chance to really benefit from her wisdom, guidance, and insight. And so with that, Meg, I'm going to turn over to you.
Thanks, Laurie. So great to see you, and nice to see a few classmates on the list of attendees today. It's really exciting. So gosh, how did I get interested in trees? I think it was at age 3 when I climbed trees as a child. Raise your hand if you ever climbed a tree in your life. Maybe most girls can at least say they got to the lower branch, if not the upper branches, but it is something I think intrinsic in our playtime childhood. And I managed to turn it into a profession as probably arguably the world's first arbornaut, which is a crazy new word for some of you. Astronauts explore outer space, and aquanauts explore undersea. And believe it or not, it wasn't until 1979 that I made a slingshot out of a piece of metal and used it to fire a rope over a tree when I lived in Australia as a graduate student, and lo and behold, got to the top of the tree, and nobody had ever explored that 95% of a tree above our heads. So it was pretty extraordinary to do that. And I will give Williams a lot of credit because my school had never heard of Williams College. It was a fairly ordinary public school in upstate New York. And even when I applied, my guidance counselor said, there is no such college. It must be William and Mary. But I said, I read about it because they have a forest. And I applied to Williams because they had their own forest called Hopkins Forest. And I was the only kid in my class that went out there and dragged branches back and counted leaves and tried to take all of my classmates on little excursions at 6 a.m., but most of them were sleeping in after a big night of partying. So it was kind of a funny world in those days where the environment was maybe a little extreme, but it gave me such a grounding. And I went off after that and pursued forest research in over 40 countries in my career, and also have worked building treetop walks for Indigenous women to get jobs and kids to get educated and all sorts of things, culminating in a project I'll talk about a little later called Mission Green, which was really founded by a bunch of Williams classmates. I took a trip to the Amazon as part of the alumni travel groups, and lo and behold, all of my business-oriented classmates had never had a biology class. They'd had economics and political science and banking courses. And of course, you know, we're really, really smart about currencies around the world, but they never knew that trees provided these millions of dollars of services. And so we all came back from the Amazon and they said, wow, we need to do something to perhaps, you know, create a business out of saving trees. So we have a cool project that I'll talk about later. But I think the neat thing is that people are starting to realize that trees are essential to our kids' and grandkids' lives. And I'm excited to be part of this conversation today.
Wow, thanks so much, Meg. That leads me to a great place to start. Before I do that, I want to let you all know we will be having a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session at the end. And you will be able to use the raise hand function at that point, or you can put your questions in the chat. Why don't we start out, ladies, with the current state of forests globally? Maybe Meg, you can comment on that. And then Laurie, you can jump in nationally and kind of talk about what the shared context is there.
Sounds great. What a good way to start. And one of the things that keeps me awake at night, and maybe some of you are sort of aware of this, but might become more aware after this, is in our lifetimes, and I'm the class of 76, admittedly, 50% of the world's primary forests have disappeared. They've mostly due to human activities, clearing, burning, agriculture, urbanization. So this is a huge dent on the planet. That's a whole lot of trees. And even our beloved United States of America cut down 97% of our primary forests. So a lot of what we look at are secondary forests, meaning we don't know what species became extinct. We don't know if the trees grow as big as they used to. We don't know if they provide the same services that they used to. But in a lot of countries, especially in the tropics, it's very hard for those trees to grow back. They don't have rich soils like America has. They don't have fencing that they can afford to let the forest grow back. So we have places like Brazil and Africa where when a forest is cleared, it takes thousands of years to recreate those precious ecosystems. So the state of global forests is pretty scary. And one other interesting fact, or maybe another scary fact that I study, is that for 200 years, foresters looked at the bottom of a tree. It was very easy to look at the tree trunk. And the only time they ever saw about 95% of the tree, which is the upper half or 3/4, was if they cut it down. And as you can imagine, the birds had flown away, the bugs had been squished or flown away. And so nobody ever knew until the last 25 years from research of mine and some of my students when I was a visiting professor at Williams, actually, that over 50% of species on the planet live in the top of a tree. So not only when we cut down a tree do we lose the knowledge of the forest, but we also lose a lot of species. So this is an extraordinary, I call it a library. It would be like burning the Louvre and the Library of Congress tonight when we go home after this webinar and saying, who cares? There's nothing wrong with that. But we're losing all these extraordinary medicines and abilities to store carbon that we'll talk about in a minute. And so we essentially really need to think hard about actions. And I'm happy that this talk today will discuss a little more about what we can all do. And I'll go segue to Laurie, who might talk about the national scene a little more.
So I think it is very easy to get depressed when we read about forests, whether globally or nationally, because we read about destruction and fire and illegal logging. But I want to encourage everyone on this call to look at the opportunity and momentum we're starting to see evolve, particularly in the US, but also countries like New Zealand. So in the United States, we've lost 40% of our forests. Most of our agricultural lands were forests. Those of you who remember the little parable about the squirrel who crossed from the east to the west coast, never touching the ground, that's how forested the United States was. And while we've had the regrowth of forests in the New England region, they're very different, as Meg was pointing out. They're quite different than the forests that were cleared. And we have to look at this from the point of view of where does this country see its future? And that's where I have hope, because the United States has more arable land, because it was forested, to be reforested and managed for healthy forests than any other nation, actually, from a percentage perspective. What we have, Meg pointed out, we cut our primary forests, but we have secondary, tertiary, quaternary forests that can be managed to restore many of those forest conditions. And when Cynthia opened this conversation, she was talking about some of the work that we're doing on the ground and that we're seeing a beginning of emulation. And that is to manage these very simplified forests to restore complexity. We're even doing the restoration in the canopy layer in our redwood forests, because that is such an important component. I had a great tree climbing experience actually 2 years and 1 year ago, Meg, going to the top of a 200+ foot tree to put ferns in. So I think that while we can look at the US forest situation and say, we've lost our primary forests, we have heavily degraded forests, we actually lose 6,000 acres of forest a day in the United States to conversion. That's the size of Delaware every year. So there's certainly threats and bad things there. But what we're seeing the emergence of is in the policy world in which we, in my organization, I personally also work in addition to the practice, we're talking about forests more, we're talking about restoration more. At the state level, we're beginning to get more meaningful investment into real forest conservation, not just saying, okay, we'll rely on the timber commodity arena to pay for forests, because they don't. And I think that the initiatives in biodiversity, if you strip away the politics of what people call 30 by 30 or other people call the Black Helicopter movement, and instead you talk about our extraordinary heritage of fish, wildlife, and plants, there is an ability to talk across that urban-rural, conservative-liberal divide. And if we focus on these shared solutions, instead of like, whose fault is this? What we see is more positive momentum. So while acknowledging the dire place we are and completely agreeing with Meg, this is our use it or lose it moment for our next generations. I think there is reason for momentum and optimism, and I see it in the United States in a number of places.
So Laurie, here's a great question back at you. I joined your board because I think Pacific Forest Trust has some of the best practices in the whole country for restoring and maintaining forests, which is great. And when I was a student at Williams, I thought all trees lost their leaves every fall. I thought fall foliage was like a global issue. And lo and behold, I found out that 80% of the world's forests keep their leaves because they're tropical. And I never knew any of that when I was a student at Williams. And now that, of course, I've worked in places like Ethiopia and Peru and Madagascar, these people need our best practices. They don't have the income to afford conservation. And our kids can't live unless those forests stay healthy, as well as our own forests. So how do we export our best practices to help all those kids in other countries keep their trees, which are essential for the health of the climate and the carbon storage and the climate change? I just wondered if you've ever thought about your organization going a little more global, and how would that look?
I think the fundamental question is the same, which is how do you make conservation financially, not economically, but financially competitive with devastation? And I say devastation because when we take old growth primary forests and we turn them into chip for fiber for various paper uses, that's pretty devastating, and it really doesn't value the forest at all. But that was true in the United States and remains true in the United States too, from a dominant financial model. Big differences obviously are law, land tenure and law, and the ability to enforce that, because you can see in Brazil, we get in a president who says, you know, Lula da Silva says, I'm going to reverse everything that Jair Bolsonaro does. And what happens? 40% increase in illegal logging. I think the root of it is that we need to make forests financially competitive, and that is paying the true price of wood. That's very difficult to do, but a lot of it is rooted in how we provide for market subsidies. And we do provide market subsidies for fossil fuels all over the world. If we as a nation also want to provide the kinds of subsidies for forest systems, that drives change the same way that we provide those subsidies to fossil fuel development all over the world. We provide them to our companies, but our companies do the exploration all over the world. It is always difficult. I worked in the UN for a little over 10 years. And it is always difficult for one country to come in and say, here, I have a great idea for you in your country. It worked in my country. And so it is difficult to bring that cultural change. In the near term, I think what we have to do is focus on these financial incentives.
That leads into a question, Laurie, that actually Timmy Haskins, class of 90, sent in ahead of time. And I think it plays into the same thing as how do we make an impact, or how do we make changes in this global deforestation with the huge companies wanting lumber and countries like you just mentioned, Brazil, not recognizing the critical role that the trees are playing in the ecosystem around the world? How can either of you recommend, like, how do you get these companies to start thinking in a different way?
Meg, shall I go first and you go, or do you want to go
whatever
first?
You like. Okay, I would say, first of all, every company is driven by consumers. If the company doesn't make sales, they change what they do. And so I think we underestimate the power of all of us, especially Williams women, who are incredibly powerful consumers. And I give 3 or 4 talks to kids every week because there's a few children's books written about my work in the rainforest, and the teachers all want the girls to learn from a scientist, I think. But it's amazing that the kids ask the same question. And the bottom line is, you know, if we continue to buy coffee that's grown from cleared forest, we contribute to the cause. If we buy shade grown coffee at Starbucks that's grown in the shade of the canopy, we help with the solution. If we buy timber that's come from Brazil, we create a problem. But if we buy timber from plantations in Canada and North America, we help with the solution. So we individually can do what we call bottom-up conservation, meaning the power of the people is extraordinary. And there's, I think, so much hope for that kind of opportunity. And more, I think corporations, I know they are very much based upon money for the shareholders, but you know, there's an increasing number of these what are called B corporations, which are benefit corporations, that have as a bottom line, part of their shareholders receive things that we call natural capital or benefits from nature, and it's part of their DNA. And I think as we all start to encourage our colleges to invest in those kinds of corporations, our personal accounts are investing in those kinds of corporations, we can make a difference, because it really is what we buy that drives things and how we act. People, one more little thing is kind of interesting, but I work in Ethiopia a lot, as I mentioned. People say, how can you work there when they each have 5 or 7 kids in every family? And the average Ethiopian kid uses 1/17, they've calculated it, of the energy footprint that an American kid makes. So in other words, you could have 17 kids in Ethiopia and use the same amount of consumption as one child in America. So not that I'm telling us all to live in a cave, because I obviously don't, but I think it just gives us pause to work with our children and help them grow up in a world where we can be much more conscious about the consumption that we have and how to do it better and cleaner in terms of saving trees and keeping our oxygen and keeping our water supply. So Laurie, you probably share the same value, but I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, just very quickly, I do think that focusing our efforts on levers that we ourselves in the U.S. can pull upon, buying preferences, your own personal ones, but also even at the local level, having city councils pass buying preferences that say, I'm going to, that community is only going to build or procure wood that comes from certified sources. So certification is a way of knowing where your wood comes from and how that forest has been managed. And ideally from conserved certified sources, where you have a closed loop between where the wood came from and the fact that that forest will always be there and always be managed for the forest. Driving your state legislatures to also do procurement preferences. Being an activist within corporations or within businesses where you express that point of view, and supporting federal representation that endorses action at the global level. I've been to a number of the Conference of the Parties since the very early days on climate change. And while the debate has gotten far more sophisticated and the data is far more developed, and we are aware of the scope of the problem to a greater degree, the investment has really lagged behind. And it is true that no single country can carry the globe, but it is also true that the United States can be a beacon in that regard. So I think that at a variety of levels, from your personal choices, and there's so many things we can do personally, to our local communities, to our states, to the country, corporations that we work with, I think there are a number of ways we can move that dial.
I was going to ask about carbon credits next, but maybe instead I'll go to a different question, that maybe there are 1 or 2 strategies that you think are effective when trying to persuade city councils or planners that preserving the urban forest areas is really more important than maybe bringing in some other businesses. How do you suggest people do that with their local government?
Can I take a first crack at that, Meg, or do you want to?
Oh, please, I'll be second, sure.
Well, first, I'd start with things that we all love. So at a community level with parks, focusing in on native plants and promoting that, those are going to be far more climate resilient than non-natives by and large. There is data that being around nature, forests in particular, makes you happier, healthier, smarter. Your kids do better on the SATs. You get out of the hospital more quickly. There is so much information about what forests do for you. If you want to get a little immune boost, go out in the forest. This is why you have days in Japan where corporations truck their people out, put them in those red pine forests and say, feeling better yet? I'm slightly joking there, but they do. There are company-sponsored holidays to get people out there. There have been some interesting, innovative collaborations between Kaiser and land conservation to reduce healthcare costs and hospital stays. So I think that the way to engage at the community level to say, hey, this is also for our benefit. It's not just because, you know, we're Lady Bird Johnson fans out of the past and we like pretty flowers. Our streets are safer, our kids are smarter, everybody's healthier, and you can do so many things together that bring people together. You know, daylighting streams, tree planting, urban gardens, native plants. These are things that by and large, very few people dislike. And so starting from that point of unification and working up.
Thanks, Laurie. That was a great summary. I think, and I will say by transparency that I was on the Urban Tree Council for the city of San Francisco for 5 years. Talk about a hot place to be. You know, we practically had death threats in times because people felt very strongly about the trees out there. And there was a huge difference between invasive trees that weren't native, and native trees, which housed all the local biology. Most of the invasive trees, I'm embarrassed to say, came from Australia, where I came from. And so that was always kind of a hot topic. But I think the important thing to really think about also is that big trees house 10 times more species than little trees. And the average age of an urban tree in America now is, I believe, 9 years, because they get cut down when medians are built or when roads are expanded or malls are stored or renovated. So there's a huge amount of tree cutting that goes along with our cement development of the urban landscape. So if we could start to realize that these big trees are kind of like chopping down, the Twin Towers, or taking out the best condos in New York City. They house all the cool species. And I used to make my students at Williams memorize the value of a big tree so they could talk about it at a cocktail party. And there are 10 things, and I'm going to say this really fast, but you can look at my website, treefoundation.org. But big trees provide fresh water, climate control, medicines, building materials, carbon storage, energy, food, a genetic library for the planet, soil conservation, and a spiritual and healthy place. And in the urban setting, they may not provide you with medicines, but they certainly provide you with better real estate values and fabulous places for your kids to play and cheaper air conditioning bills. So there's a lot of economic reasons to prioritize trees in cities, but somehow we get lost in the political mire, I think, of trying to figure out how to make those priorities. But increasingly more American cities are doing this. Austin, Texas is a great example. San Francisco, hopefully Williamstown, but I haven't checked on the latest regulations. Anyway, I think it's super important. And that's one thing that citizens can do, is check on their local tree ordinances and really push hard. And kids can be great with that. They can write letters, and children's letters mean a lot more than adult letters. So this is something a whole family can get engaged with. But I think the urban tree landscape is a place where we can all make a super big difference. And in many countries, even poor countries like India and Madagascar, they're really ahead of us because they have sacred trees. And those are the priority for the village. The big fig trees in the middle of a rural place in some of these countries is such a fabulous tourism magnet, and everybody flocks there. And unfortunately, we used to have those in America. They were called American elm. And then 99% of them died back from an invasive beetle. But we need to recreate that sense of having urban trees be part of our landscape and part of our tourism and part of our cultural experience for our children to grow up.
Okay, so Meg, in your list of 10, you didn't say that the trees provide carbon credits.
Maybe I did carbon storage, I said. That credits equals storage. It's just a different term.
Well, let's pivot back around to that, because I think that's worth delving into and explaining to people, because obviously if we just don't know a lot and we read the newspaper, it appears like carbon credits and carbon offsets are a really great thing. However, I do know they're somewhat controversial, especially out in the state of California. Would you two like to describe to all of us today, are they working? Are they doing what we think they're doing? Give us the lowdown.
Well, I'm going to take the first on this and then let Meg pick up. And I'm going to do that because my organization and I personally wrote the legislation that first got forests included in the statewide, state economy-wide enforceable climate law, and that's California's Global Solutions Act. But I want to, and from that has flowed this notion of using carbon credits within a compliance system as a step that is different from using carbon credits in a voluntary context. That model has been now leveraged across the country. There are 29 states that utilize or that have projects that meet the compliance standards of California. And I would say those offsets are effective. Remembering that an offset simply allows somebody else to actually produce and emit an emission. And that emission will be out there for over 1,000 years. So offsets need to be long-term, and most voluntary offsets are not. They're 10 years, some are even 1 year, some are 40 years. You've barely scratched the surface of that emission being reduced. So the compliance system puts offsets within the context of a consistently lowering cap, so that you know that you're not simply making things worse, you're actually making things better. And it's a rolling 100-year requirement in that offset, in the compliance market. And that offset has to be rooted in a relatively natural forest, a forest that belongs in that place. And it's relatively natural, which is to say it is not just a collection of trees. There's third-party verification on an annual basis. There's an SEC function to make sure that those credits are not double, triple, or quadruple traded. They are in fact retired. In the voluntary offset world, none of the above is necessarily true. And in most of the cases, it's not true. And so I think that carbon credits or offsets have a real place to spur action within a compliance system. And that is because in the fossil fuel industry, anything that uses an engine, it is expensive to change over those technologies, and we do want to have action now. And offsets allow you that action. But when we realize that the second largest cause of CO2 emissions globally is forest loss and degradation, and when you realize that the loss of our forests in the United States are a huge part of that, and those emissions are still out there because they're out there for over 1,000 years, the notion of relying on offsets to change the way we manage our forests and deal with that second largest source of emissions is like saying, gosh, if we change our light bulbs, we'll have solved the energy emissions from the housing and all energy sector. It's just not a sufficient tool. So I would urge folks here to, if they're going to do offsets, because that feels like the right thing to do compliance offsets. Do ones that you know make a difference. The voluntary schemes do not have the durability, the verification, the standardization, and therefore they can seem to solve something and be deceptive, frankly, in that manner. But I do want to encourage people to look at a second side of this, which is that carbon offsets are simply a commodity out of a forest. What we really need to be doing is focused on the whole forest. And that means that we want to have the same investment in the forest and land sector, that second largest source of CO2 emissions as a sector, the same way we are investing in transportation, manufacturing, and other energy production to move those away from being the polluting industries that they are. So it is by really radically but practically changing how we manage our forests that will make the big difference. Carbon credits are a tool, but they are not the solution. And I say that with deep love and affection for having fostered them within the California system, which is now spread across the country.
Okay, so I will say that I got very involved in carbon credits way back in the 1980s before most people heard of them, because it looked to be a panacea for all of us forest scientists. We founded a program called REDD, RED, which really was maybe more successful in the UK than in the US at the time. But on the other hand, having been part of that formulation of early carbon credit legislation, we have 8 billion people on the planet. About 500 million of those people live in what we call the first world, meaning they maybe have heard of a carbon credit, or they maybe have the ability to deal with a carbon credit. But I can promise you, when I go to the Amazon and work in villages, None of them have heard of a carbon credit, and nor do they realize that they might be part of a carbon credit. And what on earth does that really mean for their children to have a healthy life? So in some ways, we're talking about a real first world language and issue, and carbon credits can be manifested in two ways. One is planting a new tree, or two is saving an old tree. And it really almost gives people an excuse to pollute or fly or build a bigger house or do something that might be just offset by this kind of guilt complex. And I don't mean to sound so negative, but I'm just being very bare bones here. And so number one, a seedling never takes the place of a big tree. So never be fooled by planting trees. A koala can't live on a seedling. After my beloved country, Australia, burned so severely 4 years ago, everybody said, let's plant trees in Australia and say, put all the koalas in a zoo and then we'll put them back. But it was going to be 200 years before those trees were big enough for the koalas to live. So you can see the juxtaposition of trying to plant new trees to save the forest ecosystem. It just doesn't really work. And so saving old trees is the way to go. But a lot of these old trees are in places where those people deserve to have an income, in the Amazon and in Madagascar and in India. So my view is, how do we reinvent carbon credits for something that really provides all of those billions of indigenous people with a lifestyle? And my approach that I'll talk about later has been, how can we provide ecotourism? How can we make them realize that saving their trees can be a benefit, that people will come and photograph them and bird watch in them and hike in them and explore them? I really think we need to explore ways where we reinvent carbon credits to save the carbon in the trunk, but give the local people an income, rather than just make a donation to a country's government in exchange for allegedly saving the forest, which is always fraught with corruption and political issues. So I have my doubts about the current way that carbon credits are operated, but obviously saving those big trees needs to be the key. And how can we make sure that local people who live in the understory of those big trees get a sustainable income in some sort of process that results in saving the carbon? If you follow my sort of thread there, Cynthia.
I do. I think maybe that's something you could expand on a little bit. I know that Laurie does a lot of work in California trying to protect the old growth and the old trees. So that's obviously what's being taken down in the countries that you're working in. How in places like Peru and Brazil, what can we do here in America? How can we help these countries, help these people so that they're not taking down the old growth forest?
Yeah,
Can I
that's a
just
great.
very briefly say, we don't focus on old growth protection per se. We focus on regrowing older forests. And that actually is financially in the landowner's interest, because then there is actually more volume of timber in toto that they can take from sustainably. So what we focus on is just natural forest management, which is actually something that Meg can, I'm just tossing this to you, Meg, because natural forest management is a really important tool that can be used anywhere in the world, but the wood may cost more coming out of it.
Yeah, Laurie just brought up something kind of interesting. Here's a biology pick. Biology 101 class, listen up. But in North America, almost all the forests are on soil that was part of glaciers. Remember those glaciers that came across millions of years ago and they left all this beautiful nutrition? In the tropics, no soil has nutrients. It is devoid of nutrients because there were never glaciers or any history that gave them those nutrients. And any nutrients that exist is in the canopy of the trees. So when developers burn the canopy, which they always do, or clear the forest and drag it away on a ship, the soil can never replace a forest. So there's no such thing as really restoring a rainforest or regrowing a rainforest without thousands of years of investment of fertilizer and nutrition. So right there, we have this giant issue. How will we deal with this and what can we do with this? So that's really, really frustrating. So how do we help those people? Obviously, we have to help them by not clearing their land, but we can't put them under a glass bubble and say, please don't touch your trees. Just sit in your little teepees, and we want you to save the forest so we can have oxygen and carbon and live up in our beautiful homes in North America. So I think we have to really figure out an economic plan to help globally those people. And quite a few Williams College folks have been part of a solution that I've been really honored to work on lately. It's kind of my retirement plan, this Mission Green that was listed in, I think, one of the questions. And a friend of mine named Sylvia Earle started a program called Mission Blue, where she's trying to save the most important spots in the ocean where corals spawn or where mangroves germinate or things like that. So she and I got together and I said, I should start a Mission Green where we try to save the most endangered forests on the planet first, and then let it trickle down to other forests. And the secret sauce to Mission Green is that we're building these canopy walkways, just like Hopkins Forest, believe it or not, so that the women and families can have employment from ecotourism, because all the birding groups want to go to the canopy. All the families I know would love to take their kids to the rainforest and see the whole tree and see a sloth and see monkeys and see the moon in the middle of the night. So if we can create an income for these families that reminds them that keeping the trees is what's giving them an economy, then I think we're light years ahead of just saying to them, oh, by the way, please keep those trees because we need them for our northern lifestyle. So I'm really interested in investing in the economics of these indigenous people in a way that helps save the big trees. And in turn, that provides the carbon credits. But again, I go back to that issue. It's all about the big trees, because in places like the Amazon and Brazil, Peru, or most of Southeast Asia, with the big palm oil clearing that's going on, you can't replant those forests. Even our grandchildren's lifetime, they will not be able to replant those forests. So it's incumbent upon us who are privileged to have a college education to be able to share that knowledge. Most people in places like even the capital of Madagascar have never had the education that Williams College offers. So we need to humbly share our knowledge in ways that provide these great solutions. And you can check that out on my website. I'd love to hear more from people who have a business background. I've had a number of my Williams classmates helping me develop this program and design it in a way that had some business acumen, because guess what? I was a biology major. So, you know, we all need to put our heads together, I think, and come up with these great solutions for these other countries. Because as Cynthia pointed out right at the get-go, they are different from our own country, where we're so blessed to have the likes of Pacific Forest Trust and knowledge and investors like Cynthia's uncle that were willing to do those things because he could. But in a lot of places in the world, they just don't have that history of knowledge and philanthropy to allow it to happen.
We are
It's
heading
also
into-
worth, no, sorry, just for folks, the government in Costa Rica is one to take a look at, because they have a payment program around watersheds and around providing water. And this goes directly to communities to manage communal lands for that. Sometimes there are really wonderful examples that are effective in other countries. And so I just want to flag that there are some larger approaches that go beyond carbon credits and look at the whole forest. So, excuse me, Cynthia.
Nope, that's okay. We're heading into our last 10 minutes, and I just wanted to give people an opportunity to raise their hand, and I will try to call on as many of you as I can. I do see that Sally Cox, you have a question. Would you like to jump in?
Yes, thank you. Well, I just want to speak to the carbon credit issue, because I've been working in the Democratic Republic of Congo with a nonprofit that I founded, the Bonobo Conservation Initiative, to protect the bonobo apes, our closest
I
relative
know it well.
that no one's heard of. Do you? Well,
Yes, I do.
I want to get them. I want to connect with you on this Mission Green.
We will.
But just quickly, you know, we've been waiting for over a decade for the REDD+ carbon credit mechanism to actually be viable and workable. And for the past few years, we've been actively developing RED projects for about 9 million acres, 2 nature reserves that we created with the local communities. They're initiated by the locals, but nationally designated. And just to know, the Democratic Republic of Congo has laws, and we're following a structure where we haven't we're validating the credits now so that we haven't sold them yet, and we're hoping the price of forest carbon goes up in the next 9 months. You know, the top 15% of the gross goes to local communities. And we have just spent the past several months dealing in one of these areas. It's the size of Massachusetts. And we have gone village to village. There's about 400 villages organized in groups and sectors and so on, educating people about and getting their free, prior, informed consent to join the project, setting up local development committees. And we're going to have a channel so that the funds do not go through the national government. They get their share, province gets their share, the park authority gets their share. But we know if it goes through the national government of the Congo, no one will ever see it. So, you know, this is like a great experiment. But what you were saying, I really resonate with, Meg, and I'd be really interested to talk with you at some point because, you know, having done this conservation work for over 25 years, you know, with local people's not only buy-in, but their initiative to save their own forests, it's been like pulling teeth, you know, to get the funding and we've failed, you know, conservationists across the board have failed, at least in Central Africa, when you look at the biodiversity loss and so on, and philanthropy and government grants, and especially the top-down grants, don't work. So, I mean, we have huge hope for RED Plus, and you know, I'm just concerned, you know, there's not a compliance market, as you were talking about, Laurie, for this at this point in the USA anyway. I'd be interested in any feedback you might have about.
So Sally, I'm so excited. We'll talk offline. 2 things, because one is my friend Christian Sampier runs the Bezos Conservation Fund, and I was so excited because we're $100,000 away from funding a canopy walkway in Madagascar to hire all the local women and save the last 3% of that country's forest. And he said, sorry, Meg, we want to work in the Congo instead. So that's their priority. And he said to me, when you want to build a walkway in the Congo or set up a national park, I'll be working with you. So you and I can talk about approaching him for that. And anyway, if you have any help for me for Madagascar, we need $100,000 more, and we'll get them a beautiful $1 million canopy walkway. But what surprises me is so many groups are very focused on a certain place and time, and regardless of the urgency, that's their mission. I respect that, but you might be in luck for the Congo.
Thank you.
We are almost out of time.
Madagascar too.
We're almost out of time. Laurie and Meg, I can't thank you enough for joining me today and giving us your thoughts. Before I hand it back to Sarah, someone asked if maybe you can recommend 1 or 2 books about trees and our forests for lay people who really care about this, that want to learn about the framework and that, you know, they could learn from. Do you have 1 or 2 titles, maybe favorites, that you can throw out to everybody?
Well, I'm going to throw out Jerry Franklin's last 2 books, because even though Jerry is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and he's an extraordinary scientist himself with many thousands of publications, the last 2 books about the broad values of forests and how to manage for them are fabulous and very readable. And I will send these over to our friends at Williams to distribute. I mean, as the titles.
Thank
So
you.
someone put my book on the chat. So thank you for that. The Arbornaut gives all the stories about my challenges of global conservation from the perspective of a tree, and also my challenges as a woman student at Williams College. So there will be a lot of personal anecdotes in that book for you. But I would also recommend, a lot of times children's books are fabulous. The Leaf Detective by Heather Lang is a must for your kids and grandkids about exploring the trees. And I also really like The Great Kapuk Tree by Lynn Cherry that talks about the value of saving those trees. And finally, Richard Preston's Wild Trees is a pretty cool book about exploring redwoods. I defer to California as the quintessential iconic tree place. And one other by the Save the Redwood League, if you want a coffee table book, The Once and Future Forest is about the most gorgeous book on redwoods I've ever could imagine. So I gave you 5, sorry, not 1.
No, 5's good. Once again, ladies, I can't thank you enough for your time. This has been interesting. I hope that everyone has learned something from our questions and conversation today. Sarah, I'd like to pass it back over to you to close us out.
All right, thanks, Cynthia. I want to thank everyone again for the great discussion. I also want to actually make a comment to what Barbara just put in the chat about the centering around money. I think that I do volunteer work here in the Bay Area around climate education. And what I've really seen is that whether we like it or not, money does build capacity and the ability to shift systems. So I do think it's really important, and I can understand why this conversation was so centered on carbon credits and sort of the merits and hopefully the more systems work that we can do in the future. If you've enjoyed this afternoon's event, I'm so glad you have. And I noticed in the chat, there will be an email that comes out after this with more information. It'll reiterate the links and book recommendations that were shared here today. So look for that. If this has inspired you to get more involved as a Williams donor, that would also be phenomenal. And there are many ways to really get involved with Williams that I want to just cover briefly in the minute I have left. You can help us reach that parity we talked about with the men by making a leadership level gift to the Alumni Fund. You can become a leadership agent for your class. You can help us identify women who should be included in these conversations. One thing that I recognized in coming into this work was that women aren't always asked as often to make leadership gifts, and that asking is actually kind of a pleasure in itself. So you can think about who might want to be asked. You can also, I just lost my earring. You can also become an ambassador for Williams, talk to other EIFs about and parents about Williams women, this special moment of our 50th year and why you're a leadership donor. And last but not least, just support EIF women whenever you can. Students, alumni, you can sign up to be a mentor on EIFLink. And there's actually a lot of really interesting work on EIFLink. You can connect to other sustainability and environmentally focused alumni and become a mentor for them. And I would highly encourage it. That's all from me. Thank you all and really enjoy. I hope that your Earth Month is a good one. And thank you all again for your conversation.